It's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman. Hello, David.
Good morning.
Hope you're doing well today. And we have the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello, everybody. This is real practical, right down to your neighborhood, this program.
Today, we're going to discuss what makes democracy work. Why is American democracy in crisis? And what can we do about it? Those questions are at the core of the new film, Join or Die. Our first guest today will be civic advocate and co-director of Join or Die, Pete Davis, who firmly believes that grassroots community building is at the heart of saving our larger democracy. We'll discuss the role of clubs in American life, the relationship between club membership and effective government, the declining role of membership organizations in civic life since the 1950s, and how we can reverse that trend. In the second half of the program, we'll welcome George Washington University Professor Scott Sklar. Professor Sklar is an expert on sustainable infrastructure, and he'll join us to talk about one of the easiest ways we can reduce our energy consumption and slow down the pace of our overheating planet: white roofs. Well, not just white roofs. We have all sorts of passive cooling technologies at our disposal, and we look forward to hearing from Professor Sklar about all those options. Then to close the show, Ralph has some choice words about the media's coverage of the Republican presidential campaign and how we tend to ignore Labor Day. And on the topic of labor, Steve gives us the latest on the ongoing Writers Guild strike. As always, somewhere in the middle, we'll check in with our relentless corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. But first, Pete Davis joins us to discuss the rise and fall and rise and fall and rise and fall of civic engagement in the U.S. David?
Pete Davis is a writer and civic advocate. He is the author of Dedicated, The Case for Commitment in an Age of Infinite Browsing. He's the co-founder of the Democracy Policy Network, a policy organization focused on raising up ideas that deepen democracy, and co-director with Rebecca Davis of the film Join or Die. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Pete Davis.
So glad to be here. Thank you.
Well, this is the documentary produced and directed by brother and sister, right? Rebecca's your sister?
Yes, a 5-year project of a family film.
And it's 99 minutes long, came out this year, and it's called Join or Die. Why the title?
Well, the message of the film is it's about community in America. And, very specifically, it's about the connection between joining up in local community and ordinary civic action and its connection to a thriving democracy. And so we wanted to use that old American phrase from Ben Franklin, join or die, to show the stakes of what happens when we lose the quality in this country of being a nation of joiners. Our country is going to be in big trouble if we don't learn how to be joiners again.
Okay, so some of the examples you give of good joiner groups are the Oddfellows number 80 out of Texas, an old Federated Society chapter bucking declining trends of people joining local organizations in the community. Then there's Red Bike and Green, Atlanta, Georgia, a black urban cycling collective, bicycles. And then there's Plainsong Farm and Ministry, Rockford, Michigan, an Episcopal church on a farm. And then there's Bowl Portland, Maine, a thriving modern bowling league. And then there's Cielo, CIELO, Los Angeles, an indigenous mutual aid and advocacy group. And then there's Chicago Gig Alliance out of Chicago, rideshare drives coming together to fight for better working conditions. Now, we've discussed before, Pete, listeners should know, Pete went to Harvard Law School and shook the place up with a report called The Bicentennial Crisis of Harvard Law School, where most of the graduates are directed or incentivized to go into corporate law firms instead of public interest law. And we talked about the difference between charity and justice. Most of these groups are either social organizations, people getting together and doing whatever they do in the community, or they're service organizations. They would mostly come under the rubric of charity. They're not challenging corporate power. They're not challenging the indentured strata of government, county, city, state, national, to corporate control. So you want to clarify the limits of this documentary so that we don't talk about the documentary I would have liked you to make, but the one you and your sister Rebecca made.
Well, ever since, Alexis de Tocqueville wrote about this back in, centuries ago, and what, folks like Robert Putnam and Theda Skocpol have written about more recently, is that the basic muscles of joining start often not necessarily with explicitly political work. One of the things we've seen, there's been a decline by half in the amount of people that have attended any meeting. There's been a huge decline in the last decades of people who have taken leadership roles in any organization. There's been a huge decline in the amount of people that say they have 5 friends, and a huge increase in the amount of people that say they have 0 friends. So these real basic atomic level skills that eventually flourish into hardcore political action often start with softer civic organizing. And, as you saw in the turn of the century, the fact that there were Oddfellows lodges and Masonic lodges and Elks clubs, those would, maybe be about meeting up with your friends and, having dinner together. But they'd eventually be the place where you'd start talking about town problems together.
Because they're people who know each other to begin with.
People who know each other and begin with. And, the reason why we wanted to start with this, ordinary civic life, not necessarily just the type of kind of hardcore political action that you're always speaking of, Ralph, is I think that especially people in my generation, we really have to start with the basics. The amount of people who are 43% of Americans are part of 0 organizations, and another 20% are only part of 1 organization. So we're talking about 60, about 2/3 of the country that are not part of anything. So they don't know how to run a meeting. They don't know how to do an invitation. They don't know how to deal with tension inside of neighbors. They don't know how to plan something together in public. And I actually think that sometimes a bike collective or an immigrant mutual aid organization, or as you start getting more hardcore into a congregation that does political work, or rideshare riders that are forming a proto-union among Lyft drivers, starting with these basics of just joining is the first layer that we need to get people getting used to. And then out of that can start come the action.
You're fighting, of course, the internet gulag and the suction of people away from interpersonal community meetings into looking at screens at their iPhone and tablet. So with that as a background, because I think that's really a cause of the suction out of interpersonal community groups at the neighborhood level, give us the figures you have in your report under the title Shocking Social Science Data, spotlighted in your documentary Join or Die. You have 6 or 7 declines, so give us the summaries.
Yeah, we've had at least a 40%, probably more decline since the 70s of people who've even attended 1 public meeting. We've had a 50% decline since the 70s of people who've taken any leadership role in any organization. When it comes to religious membership, which makes up, organized religion's not for everyone, but it used to make up 50% of community organizing, and it has a huge history in politics and justice work. We've recently crossed the line into less than 50% of people are members of a congregation, when that used to be up at 90% mid-century. 50% decline when they do time diary studies, where the Census Bureau literally asks people, keep track of what you're doing each hour throughout the week. We're spending 50% less time with our neighbors at meetings. 66% decline in union membership since the 60s. And then even on really soft stuff, like between the 70s and the 90s, there was a 60% decline in the amount of picnics Americans attended annually. So everything from the goofiest way we get together in picnics and card games and meeting up at bars to really serious stuff like unions and congregations and political work, the muscles are atrophying.
What do you attribute this to? How many factors? What?
So there are a few interesting things. So one, in the big study that we feature in this movie, which is the Bowling Alone study that Robert Putnam did in the 90s, There are all these tiny things you could say contribute to it. So, suburban sprawl contributes to it. There might be a little bit of women in the workplace where, because there's two-parent families, working, two-income families working, there's more time spent at work. The biggest one he found was television, because he was doing his study before the internet even took off. And, he found all these interesting things on when television would first come to a town, you'd suddenly start seeing declines in civic life. And, there's all this writing from the original critiques of television to Neil Postman in the 80s and 90s. And now we have extreme versions of television, in our pockets, interactive, sucking up all of our time on screen times. That's a huge part of it. The biggest interesting find that Putnam found also was there's a real generational story here, where there's something happening where the civic culture is not passing from generation to generation. So people who are in their 90s now are as civic as they were 50 years ago. People who are in their 70s are a little less civic than they were, are a little less civic than them. People in their 50s a little less civic than them. People are in their 30s a little less civic than them. But the generations are not going down themselves in their civics. It's that with each successive generation, civic culture is declining. So there's something happening there. But those are what he found in his studies. We can all have our own theories of what's contributing to this. You've written and spoken so articulately about this, Ralph. I think we have Jane McAlevey, the great labor organizer in the movie, talking about, there was a concerted effort in the 70s and 80s to promote individualism as the highest ideal. And it is of interest of people who were bothered by the labor movement and the women's movement and the civil rights movement and the consumer movement to tell you, you're not all in this together. You shouldn't have solidarity. And to promote a culture of saying, joining is not what you want to do. You want to be in it for yourself. So I think there's a cultural story too.
Well, we've spent a lot of time on this program over the years, as Steve and David and Hannah know, on the massive corporate penetration of our citizenry, all the way down to undermining parental rights, selling direct hours at a day to kids as young as 3 and 4, 5, 8, undermining parental authority, drawing them away in entertainment, undermining worker rights, dealing with obstruction to justice, access to the courts, fine print contracts, can't negotiate anymore like you did with a local store, with big companies. The tax burden has shifted away from the rich and powerful, more money in campaigns, restricting civic leaders who come out of communities because they don't have money to run for office, more concentration of the media, much more use of pharmaceuticals as people that disrupts life, even right down to dispensary and elementary school over medication, it's called. And of course, the diminution of news, the dilution of news. You don't even read about or see civic and community activity anymore, shutting down of local newspapers and weeklies. So how much of this can you attribute to corporate power?
I think there's a huge part of that story. One of the things we talk about in the film, and a lot of people in the kind of community building space talk about, is the importance of what are called third spaces. This is just one corner of it. So third spaces are, if the first space is your home and the second space is your work, third space is a place out in the community that you can hang out in. In the mid-century, at the peak of kind of American civic life in the past century, a lot of third spaces were public common spaces. There were so many buildings in your average town that were owned by civic groups. There were, huge, they call, Eric Kleinenberg calls them palaces of the people, the beautiful libraries and plazas and community centers that we build. And now, one of the great tragedies is when people talk about examples of third spaces now, they say Starbucks. So, even that, the idea that the people who would set our community spaces now are either, Starbucks or McDonald's that are saying you should have your meeting here, or corporate real estate agents that are, buying up parts of corporate real estate developers that are buying up parts of town and owning the public space in the town. That's a huge part of it. That's just on one corner of community building, let alone all the union busting that corporations are doing, let alone the growth of the work week and the fact that, people aren't given the space to do the community work, let alone, media that, as you point out all the time, is raising you corporate instead of raising you civic. And so, all of this is contributing to the decline of community.
Well, in looking over the people you interview and who funded this, I was quite surprised. Maybe you couldn't have done it without the funding of the Lilly Endowment or the Alfred Sloan Foundation. That's the drug company money and General Motors money years ago, as well as the Phyllis and Jerome Lyle Rappaport Foundation. But, you interview Hillary Clinton, war criminal, full support of the destruction, criminal war in Iraq by Bush and Cheney, and toppling the Libyan regime against the opposition of Defense Secretary Gates. She persuaded Obama to do it. You interview Senator Mike Lee, a bizarre type of conservative senator. David Brooks, who has written 1,000 columns without talking about corporate crime, fraud, abuse, domination. He talks in generalities and literary allusions and philosophical allusions. I don't see really any of the kind of civic advocates that you have been associated with, worked with over the years, recognized, like Joel Rogers, for example, professor of law at University of Wisconsin, very close to the labor movement. You have to obviously make some compromises here. Could you explain?
Well, we wanted to, there were two parts of the movie that we wanted to focus on. One is we wanted to tell the story of this social science discovery, which was Robert Putnam's journey in, he did this famous study in Italy called the Making Democracy Work study, which is the most rigorous study showing that ordinary civic action is what is connected to government flourishing. 20 years studying different regional governments in Italy, trying to find the causal link of what makes democracy work, his conclusion being ordinary civic action. Then going into his Bowling Alone study, which is about, the most rigorous account of the decline of ordinary civic life in America, on the fact of the Washington civic groups versus kind of civic life out in the country. He specifically addresses that, him and Theda Skocpol, who wrote a great book, Diminished Democracy, on this, which is they were focusing not necessarily on what was going on in Washington or what was going on among kind of activist lawyers and advocates, but in towns and cities across the country, the amount of people that were part of participatory membership organizations. So one of the facts is we wanted to tell the story of his rise. And so that's going to figure into the politicians that have kind of interacted with him in his life. And then we also wanted to tell the story of the next generation of civic scholars. And that's why we were so excited to have, Jane McAlevey, the amazing SEIU 1128 labor organizer who writes amazing books on kind of the practical tips of how to do labor organizing. Priya Parker, who wrote this great book called The Art of Gathering, which is kind of also about on-the-ground practical tips about bringing people together. And Eddie Glaude Jr., who, is a great lefty in national politics today, who spoke to, a lot of the stories of corporations here, which is, if you're working 60 hours a week, if your wages are going down over the years, how are you going to have time to have civic life? And so he talks about kind of the political economy of civic life in the film. So we had to have a balance of kind of people that were part of Bob's world and people that are kind of the new generation of civic organizers.
It is puzzling that Putnam really does not focus enough on corporate domination. Like in our hometown in Connecticut, when we had a lot of small family-owned businesses, they were active. They went to town meetings. Now it's overwhelmingly chains. They can be still family-run, but they're dominated by the chains, McDonald's, Burger Chef, and Dunkin' Donuts, and so on, with these fine print contracts tying him up, in effect saying, shut up, don't get involved in any controversial local issues. Why do you think he avoided it? I mean, we've had a corporate crime wave in this country. We've had all kinds of exposés in newspapers that Putnam reads, the Washington Post, New York Times, AP, Wall Street Journal, Boston Globe. Why do you think he didn't pay attention to that? He's supposed to be an empirical data gatherer.
I do think that is, the political economy, what you could call the political economy of civic life. What is the relationship between the structure of our economy and how that affects ordinary neighborhood gathering? I think is a huge story. He touches on it a bit with labor unions. He touches on it a bit with working time. But I think I would agree that that is a part that he doesn't focus on, and that's why I'm really excited by, people like Stacy Mitchell at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance and, the
Right.
folks fighting the anti-monopoly fight today.
Right.
What they point out, people, this, Ralph, but for listeners who don't, so much of the anti-monopoly fight used to be about the consumer welfare standard, where are we just getting cheaper prices out of these monopolies? And what is so great about people like Stacy Mitchell and Matt Stoller and others who have kind of fought, and as you have talked about for decades, is there is a total cultural aspect to this too. It's not just about cheap prices. It's not just about wages and labor even. It's also about what culture do we have as a country when a bunch of small businesses that are sponsoring the Little League, that are creating, 100 different leaders in the town to be involved in something, people that actually know their own workers, people that actually know their own neighbors are replaced by a bunch of chains in a town. How does that affect not just the economy of the town, but the civic culture of the town?
The total domination, Pete, of the culture by commercialism. Everything is for sale. There used to be commercial-free zones in this country where corporations didn't dare undermine parental authority and sell bad stuff, junk food, junk drink, sugar, fat, to kids directly, plus violent programming. There used to be commercial-free zones in other areas as well. I mean, they didn't predate on the public schools the way now they want to take it over, privatize public schools. They never dared challenge the post office. Now they want to corporatize the post office, these big corporations. And, it's very important for Putnam to be spoken to very candidly, because I think he's been overwhelmed with praise by all sectors, and he's pulling his punches on the empirical reality of what's going on to block democratic activity, neighborhood activity, community activity, political activity at the grassroots, the control of the two-party duopoly by big money, freezing out third parties, independent candidates, on and on. You know all of this. You've laid the groundwork now. You have a credibility with this documentary, Join or Die, and you can move it to the next stage, because if Putnam wants to put out the fires of anti-democratic trends, he's got to look at the flamethrowers. He can't ignore the flamethrowers in the background. Please tell our listeners how they can see this documentary and the phone numbers and the contacts.
In the spirit of the movie being all about community and getting together in person, we are currently on a community screening tour where, before we hopefully next year go on, a streaming channel where you can watch it alone, this year we want you watching this film together. So if you go to joinordie.film, there is a form on our website where you can bring the movie to your community. We have congregations and clubs and universities and public health centers and even political groups and unions have brought it to be a discussion point to jumpstart a conversation in your community about the importance of ordinary civic life and community engagement. So joinordie.film is the website. And there's a form right there you can easily fill out, and we can work with you to bring it to your community.
Unfortunately, we're running out of time. Pete, we're talking to Pete Davis, the co-director with his sister, Rebecca. The title is Join or Die. It comes from Benjamin Franklin. Subtext has it, a film about why you should join the club and why the fate of America depends on it. Give the contact numbers once again slowly, how people can get this film or see this, including the trailer.
If you want to see the trailer, go to trailer.joinordie.film, 3-minute summary of the film that pretty much shows you what you're going to see. And then if you want to sign up to bring it to your community, fill out our form at joinordie.film. And that's the website for this.
Thank you very much, Pete.
Thank you.
We've been speaking with Pete Davis. We will link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Up next, are we building roofs wrong? The short answer is yes. We'll be back with the long answer after we check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, August 25, 2023. I'm Russell Mokhiber. Trader Joe's is recalling a type of cracker because the crackers might contain metal, marking the second significant recall the grocer has made in recent weeks because of foreign objects in their food. That's according to a report from CNN. The company said it was recalling its multi-grain crackers with sunflower and flax seeds due to possible metal contamination. No injuries have been reported to date, and all potentially affected product has been removed from sale and destroyed, the company said in a statement. Affected customers are told to discard the boxes or return them to Trader Joe's for a full refund. Trader Joe's recently issued a recall for 2 types of cookies because they might contain rocks. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scroven, along with David Feldman, Hannah Feldman, and Ralph. Some of our solutions to the climate crisis demand worldwide systemic changes. Others are quite simple, like repainting our roofs. David?
Scott Sklar is Energy Director of George Washington University's Environment and Energy Management Institute and Director of George Washington Solar Institute. Mr. Sklar is an expert on renewable energy, energy efficiency, and sustainable infrastructure. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Scott Sklar.
Great to be here. Thanks for letting me on.
Before we get into the subject of what white paint can do to reflect heat back into the stratosphere, Scott, and it's so good to talk with you. We've known each other for a long time. The news of the day is that Ocean City residents, not all of them, are vigorously opposing the proposed wind turbines in the ocean off Ocean City. And they've gone even further. They're contacting people all the way up the coast in New England to mobilize opposition to wind turbines everywhere. This is a real surprise. I can see where they might want some relocation. What's going on here? Is somebody behind them, or is this lack of information?
Well, it's both, Ralph. It's lack of information, but also, believe it or not, the hands of the oil industry are behind this. The first things that were happening were that whales were wound up dying off the New Jersey coast. And there was a big rush to blame offshore wind turbines. And I was interviewed by the media quite a bit on this. And I said, well, the first real problem is there were no offshore wind turbines. So they obviously weren't killed by them, nor were the approaches to map the ocean. They weren't using what the miners used to, echo kinds of radar. So, and I said, and frankly, whales don't bump into stationary things. 95% of all whales are killed by ships, and 90% of all those ships are oil tankers. So that's what is the game here. I think the oil industry was sort of trying to slap at the wind guys to get the spotlight off themselves. The other issue, frankly, is the visuality. And again, if you look at off the shore at these offshore wind turbines, they would be the size of a sugar packet turned on its side. So you could see them. They won't be like huge. They would be larger, in fact, than most of the ships that you see on the water. It's been also magnified. And I guess what I say to everybody about this is zeroing out carbon and nuclear, frankly, is that you have to have a lot of renewables. And having renewables offshore are probably one of the best things you could do. So lowest cost for sure, and absolutely reliable, and giving us the gigawatts we need before the planet climate collapses. So that's my response.
Let's get to the white paint issue. This is very encouraging. Of course, people in North Africa have known this for years, and other parts of the Middle East where they paint their building structures white. Casablanca means white home, because they've known that it cools down what could be an insufferably hot area where they live every day. So in the news recently, a professor of mechanical engineering at Purdue University, his name is Professor Ruan, R-U-A-N. He was working with different kinds of paints, and he stumbled on a formulation where now he claims with some credibility that, for example, if you painted the roof of your home or apartment building with that kind of paint, it would increase the reflection of the sunlight back up to 98%. And if that's done all over the world, it would give quite a bit of time for the conversion away from fossils and nuclear to renewable. and conservation of energy to take deeper hold over the planet's human energy needs. Can you explain this white paint? I first learned about it, Scott, from my friend Art Rosenfeld, who was Mr. Conservation.
Too. Sure.
Yeah. People in California are benefiting every day from his energy conservation work when he was a state official, and then he was called to Washington, the Department of Energy, to do the same thing. And he made a big deal out of white paint. So can you inform our listeners about what's the status here and how quantitatively significant can it be?
Okay. Well, if you want to say Art's had been an old and dear friend and colleague of mine, I want to start by framing the conversation that in the 2020s, we have lots of different approaches to reflect heat out of building. We have thermal barrier paint. We have reflective coatings, and white paint is part of that. We have low-E coatings on windows. We have mechanical devices that pull heat out of buildings. So we have a huge set of options. And even if you just use the white paint, the high reflective white paint, or even the most ceramic reflective white paints that I use in the renewable projects, you can reflect about 30 to 40% of the sunlight out of the building, which reduces your air conditioning bills by 20 or 30%. So they're cost effective, they make sense. What this professor did is say, can we maximize the reflection of the heat, the subset of rays that come from the sun that are just related to heat, which is exactly what low-E coatings do in windows, but maximize it on roofs. And that's really what he has done successfully. Again, we have some issues on how we can scale that up and what materials it really works on and things like that. But the end point is the right point, and the approach is the right approach, that we need lots of low-cost, simple ways to reduce our energy use quickly to affect these impacts of climate change that we're beginning to really get a hard dose of.
Do you have any data on how many homes and apartment buildings and business buildings have white roofs?
Well, actually, that's a good question. I think we have about 10,000 buildings out of basically 500,000 buildings that have pure white roofs. And we have another 25,000 that have not pure white roofs, but light roofs that reflect some of the heat off. So we have a very small percentage. And even I live in a bedroom community of Washington, D.C., Arlington County. And when my neighbors are looking at roofs, I say, well, pick the lightest shingles you can get. White is preferable, but even the lightest gray or lightest brown reflects out. And we need building codes to do this. We need community activists to do this. We need to train roofers and builders to do this. And we need to create sort of a social compact that this is very easy to do. And so with this and things like tree canopy, we can reduce the heat on the ground, which will save lives, make people healthier, and use less energy. And that's really the end goal.
Isn't California leading the way in its code of new construction, requiring something like this?
California, no question's the lead, but I have to say there's some great programs in Arizona, New Mexico, and Nevada. Again, all those states are dealing with, record high heat and are experiencing it and having to set up cooling centers if the grid goes down so people don't die in their homes and businesses. So we need to focus this even more, obviously elsewhere, but even more in those 4 states as well.
What's going on in Congress on this?
Well, Congress passed 2 bills, one in December 2021 called the Infrastructure Bill, and one in August 2022, the Inflation Reduction Act. And it does have incentives both for federal procurement. Remember, the U.S. government's the largest owner of buildings in the world and the largest user of energy in the world. By the way, that everybody who pays taxes pays for that energy bill. So it has a lot of options that the feds can do to step into this problem, and they are beginning to do that seriously. And then there is efficiency incentives, energy efficiency incentives, primarily in the Inflation Reduction Act, and building envelope issues can be addressed in it. But remember, it goes through the states and local governments. So what you asked originally, Ralph, is we need to get the local governments really focused on what they can do. In my local government area, we have solar co-ops to buy solar. We're starting to see solar heat pumps, cut air conditioning costs in half. Wouldn't it be great to have reflective roof co-ops so that anybody who's thinking of renovating or building, generally all you're doing is joint buying, so the purchase price is less. So you get your equipment at lower cost and higher quality. So we need to do things like that. And that's why this show is so important.
Well, you practice what you preach. Your home is solarized. You have another building you work in. Describe it. Is also solarized. Are you saving money as well as?
Oh, yes. And of course, we had a giant windstorm here a couple of weeks ago where winds were over 70 miles an hour, knocking out power lines and trees. And my two buildings were totally operational. I had people leaving their medicines in my refrigerator and charging their cell phones on my dining room table. But yes, I have two buildings where I give weekly tours, mostly engineers and architects and professors and students, but also others. And my back office building is a small 2-story office building with R50 insulation, with super insulating windows, with solar daylighting, bringing in natural light without the heat, full spectrum light, a solar battery system and wind also, a small wind turbine, and a small hydrogen fuel cell. And that runs that 2-story building without any electricity. So it's 100%, they call these zero energy buildings. Not that they use zero energy, but they take no energy from the electric grid. And that's my office building. My home on the same piece of property has R38 insulation, has double pane argon-filled windows with low E coatings. Remember, the low E is what reflects the heat rays of the sun off the windows. Thermal barrier paint sprayed under the attic roof. It actually acts like a white roof in that it just reflects the heat waves back out. And of course, all LED lights and Energy Star, the most efficient appliances, and then a solar water heater, and then a geothermal direct exchange heat pump. And so I use 67% less electricity heating and cooling my house than any other technology. And then finally, photovoltaics, multi types of photovoltaic panels, so I can show people their options in a very large battery bank. And again, this building, I have so many batteries, I joke that the sun could be stolen tomorrow and my daughter could throw parties in my house every day for a month. I mean, it's a huge amount of storage. So I just bought an electric car last year and I added some more solar panels. So the electric car is now 100% powered by solar energy.
We're talking with Scott Sklar, longtime solar energy advocate and practitioner. People listening may be excited enough to want to know how to contact you. Can you give them a website?
Yes, I have it under my company name, the Stella, Stella Group Ltd.com. I also have a website through George Washington University, and that's www.gwueemi.edu. And I have an email. I'm happy people email me. Because I'm so old. I am at solarsklar@aol.com. That's solar and my last name, Sklar, @aol.com.
There you are. Now, the big question on the topic, Scott, is quantitative significance. And there's a stunning estimate made by Professor Jeremy Munday, a professor of electrical and computer engineering at the University of California, Davis, who researches clean technology. And he said this, hard to believe. He said, if materials such as the Purdue professor's ultra-white paint were to coat between 1 and 2% of the Earth's surface, that's between 1 and 2% of the Earth's surface, slightly more than half the size of the Sahara Desert, the planet would no longer absorb more heat than it was emitting, and global temperatures would stop rising, end quote. Now, he admits there's side effects, wildlife, etc. But apart from that, can this be true?
Well, let's just say it could be a ballpark, but I do want to point out two other facts. The American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy, ACEEE, which is the efficiency think tank founded by Art Rosenfeld, said that we could reduce 50% of all greenhouse gas emissions within 30 years using energy efficiency and at lower cost than any kind of electricity generation. So it's faster and lower cost than any time. You will save money reducing half our greenhouse emissions with energy efficiency, of which these reflective coatings are one of. And then the other one is Lawrence Berkeley Labs, the Federal Department of Energy lab based in California, did a study that shows that energy efficiency costs equate to about 2.1 cents to 3.3 cents a kilowatt hour. And most people in the United States are paying 8 to 20 cents a kilowatt hour. You would be spending less money to save energy and making money immediately when it pays back, some of which is from a half a year to 2 years. So these make sense. Now, back to your question is, yes, we need to do a lot of different things. The problem is it's cross borders. Just as we're seeing what you raised, Ralph, in New Jersey, we have people pushing back for lots of different kinds of reasons. So I'm, as one who is a professor and a practitioner and a businessman in the field, I am pushing for these collaborative efforts where you get groups of communities that agree to something and then just work it and rev it up. So that way you're teaching locally, you're acting locally, and you're building consensus.
The obvious 800-pound gorilla in the room is the contradiction where corporations in energy arenas make more money selling waste, which is overuse of energy, and consumers save money by the efficient use of energy. So there's a dead-on conflict between the two interests, and guess who has the most power in the country over government and media? So what Scott is saying is the more you realize what you personally can save, quite apart from what your community and world can save, the more powerful you have to become on 535 members of Congress at least, in addition to your state legislatures, and try to redress that terrible imbalance of power between the waste profiteers and the efficiency desires of consumers and families and homeowners.
Ralph,
and
you are
et cetera.
100% correct on this. And I worked as a energy staffer during the oil embargoes in the 1970s. And, the oil industry and coal industry and nuclear industry, utility industry lobbied brutally against renewable energy, energy efficiency, Clean Air Act requirements against their energy resources, and later on climate change. And it's up to us to be the counterweight to that. And we need to do it. And the best way to do it is at the local level, because that changes minds. And those members of Congress respond when there's lots of community groups doing these kind of projects.
Hannah?
Just a counterpoint, black goes with everything. So,
I was thinking even after Labor Day? Right after Labor Day?
It's slimming, it's chic, unless you're wearing navy.
So Hannah, I am fine and support black clothes. I have no problem. I just suggest that people don't wear it in the middle of the summer. Wear the whites and lights for reflection. But in wintertime, wearing black makes good sense. So I will support you at least halfway, Hannah, on this one.
For the record, that was a joke. Just for the radio, for people who will inevitably take me literally. But actually, to that point, let's say, if listening to, it seems like such a simple idea. Great, paint everything white. If I'm so enthusiastic and I want to just run out and get white paint and paint my house, my driveway, paint everything white, Is that always a good idea? If I'm living at a certain latitude, is that a bad idea? Do you have any kind of like caveats?
Well, of course, first of all, not all coatings are safe. So, painting your driveway white, I would think about that first on how it interacts with water and wildlife. But definitely, if you're rehabbing your house or building a house or summer home or working with your community on a new school or nursing home or multifamily homes, make sure that they put in there not only energy efficiency, but white roofs. And of course, low E coating windows and energy efficient windows. I think that's a big thing you can do. Again, if you're repainting your house, I wouldn't go out and just do it. But if you're repainting your house, think that, again, the lightest colors reflect the most heat. Doesn't have to be pure white, but lighter is generally better. And then in my community, we're dealing with stormwater management. So with the driveways, we're actually encouraging permeable pavements, which is basically holes in whatever you're using so water can get down, and usually some rocks and sand underneath so it can filter down so it doesn't run in the street and pollute, in our area, the Chesapeake Bay, the country's largest inland estuary. And we're doing lighter color pavements at the same time as permeable pavements. All of that makes sense, and all of it should be done together, and all of that needs to be done at the community level. I think that's the new power, is local communities and people working together for a common cause.
Well, we're out of time. Thank you very much, Scott, for your observations. And people who want to get more information about topics that we only touched on in these last few minutes can go to what informative website?
Well, I would just Google George Washington University Solar Institute or George Washington University EEMI, which is the Environmental and Energy Management Institute. And we have lots of information. And again, or you can email me at solarsklar@aol.com. I have, since I'm a professor at 4 different kinds of courses, I have tons of information. Happy to share with you. I want to thank Ralph. I haven't spoken with you in about 40 years, but you're one of my heroes. And I want to thank everybody for being interested in this topic. It's critical.
You're very welcome, and you're very enlightening. And if we get any contradictory emails, we'll send them to you for response.
Absolutely. Happy to do that.
Thank you very much, Scott Sklar, professor, solar energy advocate for decades, practicing what he preaches in his own home and adjacent buildings. Thank you very much, Scott.
Thank you all.
We've been speaking with Scott Sklar. We'll link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Ralph, before we close, you have some political observations you want to share with us.
Well, now we've seen the first Republican Party presidential debate, and it's important to ask why the mainstream media is so narrowly focused. Here's the way they cover presidential candidates, especially the two parties. When the announcement is made by a candidate, they give a summary, the pitch, the announcement speech, and then subsequently they look at the polls and they look at the money. And if the money isn't coming in, the pollsters don't register very high polls, and if they can't get in the polls at visible levels, they don't raise much money. At the same time, the New York Times and Post have regular reports on all the candidates' fundraising month by month. And it's done in a context of highlighting the role of money in politics. But they don't go to the next stage. I'll give you an example. Asa Hutchinson, who was a former member of Congress, a moderate Republican, former governor for several years of the state of Arkansas. He worked in the Department of Homeland Security. He was number 2 in deputy in the DEA agency in Washington. He was a U.S. attorney. He throws his hat in for the presidential Republican nomination, and he gets almost no press. He gets no press because he's not raising much money. On the other hand, someone who people never heard of, Vivek Ramaswamy, he made a lot of money in some bio-drug industry initiatives, and he's spending a number of millions of dollars on his campaign. He's 38 years old, and he gets all kinds of coverage. in the Washington Post and New York Times. He has some pretty outlandish positions. He praises Trump. And there you are. There's the contradiction, isn't it? They bewail the role of money in their editorials. They report the money all the time. And then they don't admit that their coverage is skewed by who raises more money than someone else. So someone as experienced as Asa Hutchinson gets a fraction of the coverage that Ramaswamy has been getting. The second point I'd like to make relates to upcoming Labor Day. I've often wondered why the Democrats who claim they're for workers and labor unions don't make more of Labor Day. There are hardly any more Labor Day parades anymore. Talk about declining engagement. Used to be in all kinds of cities, vibrant Labor Day parades. Now there are very few left, and the turnout is much less. But there are all kinds of things the Democratic Party can do to bring workers together, to have news conferences where workers voice their concerns, highlight the necessity to increase the minimum wage, labor law reform to facilitate forming unions against giant multinational corporations that are not unionized, and many other things, worker health and safety in the workplace, inadequate coverage by health insurance. They don't do any of that. They just go around their routine, shaking hands and telling the listeners who they are with a few slogans. So it's a real huge opportunity. It's one reason why the Democrats are losing elections to the Republicans. They've lost the contact with blue-collar, everyday workers. So I think it would be good if people were interested in one of the best labor autobiographies I've ever read by a unsung labor organizer and prolific writer hero whose name is Harry Kelber. He won the Callaway Award in his mid-90s. He lived to almost be 100, passed away a few years ago. He wrote an autobiography called My 70 Years in the Labor Movement. And he called out crooked or overly bureaucratic labor union leaders. He didn't play favorites. He was as honest as can be. And if you want to read about what the labor movement used to be like in its best moments and what it can be like, read this book, My 70 Years in the Labor Movement. You can actually get a few of the remaining copies by going to laboradvocate.org, and for $30, you can get the book, which includes postage.
Well, speaking of labor, Ralph, I'm on strike still as a member of the Writers Guild of America, and I can give you a little update on what's going on there if you'd like.
I'd like it very much because I'm on strike too. I belong to the SAG-AFTRA labor union. I've been trying to help by assigning my modest royalties directly to the SAG-AFTRA Foundation, which is trying to help workers who don't make much money in this industry pay their bills. And I'm having a great deal of difficulty in signing over these royalties to the foundation. That was my modest way of contributing, since I'm not out there on the picket lines the way you are, Steve.
Yeah, and there was a huge SAG rally at Disney that I attended yesterday, and there was a update last night. The companies put out a proposal that they had offered to the Writers Guild on August 11th, which is, as we're recording this, it's about a week and a half ago. And here's how the WGA responded. I just want to read the short little missive that'll kind of encapsulate what's going on. It says, "Dear members, after 102 days of being on strike and of AMPTP, that is the organization that negotiates for the companies, after AMPTP silence, the companies began to bargain with us on August 11th, presenting us for the first time with a counteroffer. Now, in the past, they had not, there were three issues that they didn't even bother to counter, which was AI, streaming residuals, transparency in streaming residuals, so we know how successful a show is, so we know what piece of the pie we deserve. And in the writer's case, this is a little bit different from the actor's demands, minimums in writers' rooms. So that being said, the WGA told us, we responded to their counter at the beginning of last week and engaged in further discussions throughout the week. On Monday of this week, we received an invitation to meet with Bob Iger, Donna Langley, Ted Sarandos, David Zaslav, and Carol Lombardini. They're all CEOs except for Carol Lombardini, who is the lead negotiator for the AMPTP. It was accompanied by a message that it was past time to end this strike and that the companies were finally ready to bargain a deal. We accepted that invitation and in good faith met tonight in hopes that the companies were serious about getting the industry back to work. Instead, on the 113th day of the strike, and while SAG-AFTRA is walking the picket lines by our side, we were met with a lecture about how good their single and only counteroffer was. We explained all the ways in which their counters, limitations, and loopholes and omissions failed to sufficiently protect writers from the existential threats that caused us to strike in the first place. We told them that a strike is price, and that price is an answer to all, and not just some of the problems they have created in the business. But this wasn't a meeting to make a deal. This was a meeting to get us to cave. And which is why, not 20 minutes after we left the meeting, the AMPTP released its summary of their proposals. This was the company's plan from the beginning, not to bargain, but to jam us. It was their only strategy to bet that we will turn on each other. Tomorrow, we will send a more detailed description of the state of the negotiations, and we will see you all out on the picket line so that the companies continue to see what labor power looks like. So that's the situation.
And I would also urge the range of impact by the unions to be broader, to focus on JP Morgan, BlackRock, Apple, big investors in the entertainment industry, and put the heat on them as well. Listeners should know this is not an ordinary strike for just higher wages and benefits. Many of these writers and actors are going to be exposed to losing their jobs entirely by artificial intelligence and other consolidations. So when Steve talks about the word existential, he is not exaggerating.
I want to thank our guests again, Pete Davis and Scott Sklar. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the Wrap Up, featuring Francesco DeSantis. And in case you haven't heard, a transcript of this program will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour Substack site soon after the episode is posted.
The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon. Our associate producer is Hannah Feldman. Our gopher emeritus is John Richard. Our social media manager is Stephen Wendt.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody. Remember, try to become a Capitol Hill citizen. We'll talk more about it in future programs. But for now, you can learn about Capitol Hill citizenry by obtaining a copy of the latest edition of the Capitol Hill Citizen newspaper. 40 pages. Go to capitolhillcitizen.com and you'll get it back first-class mail. Print only.
Say you're just one person, and who will hear your voice? Don't let them fool you. You have the power in your hand. I'm only trying to school you.